Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs Daily War Room Update. I'm Maurice Hirsch here from Jerusalem, and we are coming to you today to provide the context for the war that's going on, both down south with the terrorists in Gaza, up north with the terrorists in Lebanon, down to the southwest and to the southeast, with the Houthis, and really all focusing on the war with our enemy from the east, with Iran directing its proxies, its octopus tentacles to attack Israel in every different scenario that's possible. What we're going to discuss today is the update, the regular update on what's happening on the ground with the fighting forces, and then we'll have a discussion with Professor Talia Einhorn, who I'll introduce her in a second, about the other facets of this war that's going on and that Israel is facing. It's not only the physical war on the ground, but rather a virtual war and a war in the courtrooms of the world about the laws of war, what's going on in Gaza, to what extent is Israel respecting or breaching the laws of war, and to what extent does that really focus on what's happening between us and our enemies, or is there really an underlying message that's going on there? We'll also discuss a little bit, obviously, on what's going on in the International Court of Justice. There are two parallel events going on there at the moment, which both need to be, addressed to an extent, and really with some of them, as we'll hear probably in the next few days, with the complaint that South Africa submitted to the International Court of Justice, accusing Israel of no less than genocide. We're expecting, according to a report today in the Israeli news, a decision of the court on the interim sanctions that South Africa requested already within the next few days. So before we delve into that, let's give that update on what's going on the ground in Gaza. In Gaza, the IDF forces are continuing the operations on the ground, really hand-to-hand fighting, house to house, every single house being used in Gaza by the terrorists as a base from which to attack Israeli forces, a base from which to attack Israeli citizens. I apologize for the graphic nature of what I'm about to say, but here's one of those stories. In the last few days, we've heard the story of an IDF soldier who was murdered on the first day of the massacre on October 7. He was decapitated. His head was then taken into Gaza and held there by the Hamas terrorists, who put it up for sale for $10,000. Yes, you heard right. They were selling the head of an Israeli soldier for $10,000. In the meantime, they kept the head on ice in a freezer in a candy store. That is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with the terrorists who have dug 20 meters into the ground in order to have tunnels there with cells in which they held some of the 240 hostages that they took captive. We're talking about the terrorists who are continuing to fire rockets and mortars and missiles at Israel while they complain that their food is running out, their water is running out. They don't seem to be running out of rockets and missiles, even though the IDF has in the last few days uncovered and destroyed massive factories for creating and for really producing massive amounts of munitions and rockets in Gaza. No one's really talking about, well, how were these underground tunnels dug? Where did they get all of that equipment from? They've been claiming for years that Gaza is an open-air prison, which is under siege, which it really hasn't been, or under blockade, which it really hasn't been, and yet they've managed to bring in engineering equipment that will allow them to dig 20 meters underground, providing a metro system which is really bigger than London's metro system, London's underground. I grew up in London. I've traveled that underground many times. And the tunnels under Gaza are more extensive than the entire London underground. That's something which really does have to sink in, that underground serves 15 million people. The tunnels in Gaza only serve the Hamas terrorists, as one of their terrorist leaders said. Well, why don't you let the civilians in Gaza go into the tunnels to escape the Israeli bombardment? So he argued. Well, his answer was very simple. The tunnels are there for the mujahideen, for the fighters. They're not there for the civilians. They're the problem of the international community. So we're continuing fighting. We're moving in more and more of a stronghold into Khan Yunis, into the surrounding areas of the middle of the Gaza Strip as well, not only consolidating our forces and stronghold in the northern Gaza Strip. Moving to the north, we're continuing on with that same war of attrition. Hezbollah keeps on attacking Israel, and Israel keeps on responding. Yesterday, we saw another targeted assassination of Hezbollah terrorists. I don't use the word militants. I don't use the word activists. They are terrorists, and let's call them by their name. These are terrorists, and their goal is to really inspire fear in the other side in order to achieve their political goals. So what have they done? They've been firing rockets and missiles and attacking Israel's northern border without even invading Israel. They've managed to cause the evacuation of 80 to 90,000 people from Israel's north. And really, they've already achieved their goal of really pushing that terrorism upon Israel and distancing Israel's civilian population even from our own border. In the south east, really, the Houthis are continuing on, another Iranian proxy, continuing on to interfere with the channels of navigation and freedom of navigation on the seas, interfering with all of the maritime traffic going round the Horn of Africa and then up through Bab el-Mandeb into the Red Sea and eventually through the Suez Canal. This is causing a massive loss of income to Egypt, but Egypt, unfortunately, has a problem. Egypt doesn't care about its peace agreement with Israel. Once the Houthis are attacking the Jews on behalf of Iran, Egypt is doing nothing. Egypt isn't even part of that international coalition fighting the Houthis, something which is causing them damage that's estimated between $100 and $125 million a day of shipping movement through the Suez Canal. Egypt is suffering that blow simply because, unfortunately, of its hatred for Israel, despite the peace agreements. Then we move, obviously, internally, Judea and Samaria. There the fight is carrying on as well. It's the same terrorist organization, the same Hamas, the same PFLP, the same Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the same Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades, that organization that belongs to Fatah, that organization that's headed by the so-called moderate Mahmoud Abbas, this person, this organization that the US administration, for whoever knows whatever reason, would like to see them continuing to play a role both in Judea and Samaria and in Gaza in the future. The terrorists who are attacking us are meant to be the ones who are promoting peace. That has to be understood. And all that comes together and is really surrounded by this very broad support from NGOs and from other countries that are really trying to fill the world with what is called lawfare. Lawfare is the use and abuse of the legal system, making sometimes just outrageous claims based on the idea that most people don't know any better, and so their claims can go over as propaganda. And in some cases, using actual law, courts of law, like the ICJ, in order to promote their propaganda and their malicious intentions and support for the terrorists in Gaza at the same time. And for that, I'm honored to be joined by our special guest for today, Professor Talia Einhorn, who Professor Talia Einhorn I've known for many years. She's one of those people who is really a tremendous a source of inspiration for Israel's legal system in general. She's fighting for Israel's legal rights, she's obviously a professor of international law. She's presenting Israel's case in the best way possible around the world. And we really are very honored to have her with us today. Professor Einhorn, give us a little bit of a rundown. I know this is stuff that is probably very elementary for you, but for some of our viewers and really for the world around, and these broadcasts do get spread very broadly around, let's understand a little bit of what's being claimed about going back to what's going on in Gaza, that Israel is acting disproportionately. What is that idea of proportionality in international law, in international humanitarian law, the laws of war, things which I know are basic for you, but really have to be understood by the wider population?
Well, thank you very much for having me today, Maurice. I appreciate it very much, and I'm glad to be your guest today. I'm honored to be your guest. Well, before we go to proportionality, maybe we first have to understand what we have now in Israel. On the 7th of October, this terror organization, Hamas, its people and people from Gaza, simply invaded Israeli communities beyond the green line, the green armistice line that we've had. And they, as you had said in your initial presentation, they caused the evacuation of people around Gaza Strip without any reason. I mean, there was no reason for simply this attack. Now, what did they do during this attack? You told also some of it. They used the worst kind of crimes. Indeed, they behaved in a way that what's called genocide. I mean, the idea was to kill men, women, civilians who celebrated, had a concert there, enjoyed a rock concert there, Nova. And without any reason, they simply went inside. Now, what do the laws of war say about such behavior? To begin with, some people have the idea that a terror organization is not bound by any rule of law. Well, this is wrong. When you go to fight, you have to obey the laws of war, even if you are a terrorist organization. And this means that you're not allowed to attack civilian populations just like that. And not to mention, of course, all the rockets that they have been launching at Israeli civilian centers. All of their attacks, in fact, are aimed first and foremost against Israeli civilian population. Now, what are their real goals? We hear them all the time. It's written in their charter. Their charter says, more or less, from the river, the Jordan River to the sea, they want Palestine. Now, in the history of the world, when there were wars, there were also refugees. In the normal course of affairs, each party took care of its own refugees. And indeed, the state of Israel, since its inception, took in refugees from Europe. I mean, the 600,000 Jews who were living here at the time of the War of Independence, Israel's War of Independence, they took about 600,000 from Europe and another 600,000 from all Arab states. Now, you would expect that the Arabs who fled the tiny Israel within the Green Line, they should have been taken care of by their brothers, so to speak, those who even encouraged them to get out of the state of Israel so they would come back victorious, which didn't happen, fortunately for us. But what happened instead was that the United Nations established for them, these refugees only. From all refugees of the world, they have their special organization called UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Organization. And this special body is there simply to make their problem eternal. They keep them in refugee. The Israel of my childhood had refugee camps of Jews from everywhere, from Europe, from Arab countries. I remember them. But nowadays, look at Israel, it's thriving. We don't have Jewish refugee camps. The Palestinians are still living in refugee camps, not in Gaza, in the West Bank, what we call Judea and Samaria. It's the West Bank from a Jordanian point of view, and wherever they are. And they're still counted as refugees forever. Even if they settle elsewhere, they still count as refugees. And those who sit in Gaza say, well, we don't want to live in Gaza. We want to live in Tel Aviv and Haifa. We don't want this Jewish entity at all. We don't recognize the state of Israel. And this is true for Hamas. This is also true for the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And in fact, when there were elections in the West Bank, it turned out that the majority voted for Hamas. They are the largest party in the Palestinian parliament. Even today, also the speaker is a Hamas person. So this is the kind of situation that we're in. Now you're asking, what about proportionality? What's proportionate? If you open the American State of Department Law of War Manual, it has a chapter on proportionality. And it says, if you were attacked in a certain way, the civilian population was attacked in a certain way, then it's proportionate to have reprisals and attack them in the same way. Now, of course, the Israeli Defense Forces don't do such things. They don't chop parts of bodies. They don't decapitate people. Quite the contrary. When the IDF walked into Gaza, they told the civilian population to separate itself. They sent down pamphlets. They called them. They did everything they could, our Israeli forces, to tell them, stay away from the Hamas. So we are at war. And when you are at war, the rules of war apply. And the rules of war dictate that Hamas too, even though it's a terrorist organization, its duty is to comply with the rules. And it's their duty to help separating the civilian population from the combatants. What do they do instead? Of course, not that at all. They hold the civilian population as human shields. Now, since they are a terror organization, do you want to ask a further question now, or?
So really what we need to discuss within that context is two different things, if I may. One is the idea of proportionality, which is what is, exactly as you defined it, what is a proportionate response to the butcher, massacre, murder, burning alive, beheading, raping of men, women, and children? What is a proportionate response to that? And then there's a separate idea. It's one of the things that you mentioned, and as you said, is also covered within even the Department of Defense war manual, is this idea of reprisals. Reprisals is a special category in and of itself. It's something that Israel, for whatever reason it is, hasn't done. Reprisals are by nature something which are extraordinary to the normal fighting that's conducted on the ground, but really of use of extraordinary force. I won't get too much into the exact legal definition, because I think that would be too much. But it should be understood that there's proportionality on the one hand, which looks at individual attacks on specific targets, and then there's a whole other idea of reprisals. That's what we're discussing generally, I think, is the idea of proportionality and the use of force. How do we target? How do we justify the idea of targeting schools and mosques in the Gaza Strip? And why is that not outrageously a breach of international law? And how can it be that, well, on the Israel side, so you lost 1,200 people, but look, 30,000 people have died in Gaza. So that's clearly disproportionate. Is that the right way to look at things?
No, not at all. That's not the way anybody would look at proportionality in the time of war. The idea of proportionality has it has to be looked at from two angles. One is, what's the advantage for the fighting army? And the second is not to hit civilian population on purpose, and definitely not to direct attacks at civilian population. Now, Israel, one has to say, is even putting its own soldiers often a danger in order not to cause disproportionate damage to civilian population. But let's talk about hospitals and schools. Hospitals and schools have special protection in international law, as long as they serve their purpose. Now, what did we learn about Gaza? There are about 30 hospitals in a very small area. But what do they do in these hospitals? The hospitals are used as places for armaments. Their personnel are often Hamas members. And at the schools, you launch rockets from the schools. The teachers are terrorists of Hamas. The education the children get is from day one, from kindergarten. They're told that to become shaheeds, that is people who will commit suicide and blow themselves up in Jewish civilian population, that is the aspiration of the child. That's what he should be looking forward to do when he only can do that. These aren't schools. And by the way, UNRWA, the personnel of UNRWA are themselves terror supporters and sometimes often actively participate, as we have seen. There were members of Hamas who kept hostages. The hostages who were freed, the few they said that they were also kept by a school teacher from UNRWA. I mean, what kind of school teachers are these? And the hospitals and the schools, and in fact also the private homes, they have underneath openings in piers into which you go into these huge tunnels. There's a whole underground city that is also under the hospital. As soon as hospitals and schools are used this way, they become military targets. They're no longer civilian buildings that deserve this special protection. The rules, you're invited to open the Department of Defense manual, Law of War manual, is full text available on the internet. And 1,250 pages, you can read them, you will find answers to any question that you may have. Now, look at what happened in the International Court of Justice. Not only has Israel been the victim of the genocidal behavior of the Hamas, but South Africa brought a case against Israel as if Israel is the one that commits genocide in Gaza. If you open the statement of claim, what does it say? It tells that on the 7th of October, without any provocation, Israel attacked the Gaza Strip, which is 180 degrees from the reality on the ground. It was just the other way around.
It's unbelievable. South Africa's claim was truly an inversion entirely of both fact, law, morality, everything. When you go through the South African claim, they adopt and parrot simply the propaganda that's put out by Hamas, starting with the number of victims. We know that the number of victims that Hamas claims as being really lapped up by the entire world, and then quoted as if it is really unequivocal fact, when really the truth is no one really knows how many people have actually died in Gaza. As we've said repeatedly, those numbers from Hamas, parroted by South Africa, also include that big jump in the number of victims on the 17th of October. For those of you that don't remember, the 17th of October, there was a special event where Israel allegedly attacked a hospital in the Gaza Strip, the Al Ahli hospital, and caused the death of 500 people. Within hours, it became clear that, firstly, Israel hadn't attacked the hospital. It was an errant missile of Palestinian Islamic Jihad. There hadn't been 500 victims, but maybe at worst 20 victims. But the numbers provided by South Africa, based on the reports of the Hamas Ministry of Health, remained the same. Incredible. And South Africa just pushed that into this whole complaint, really distorting any type of reality, and never once referring within that number to how many terrorists have actually been killed. It's as if there are no terrorists in Gaza. Israel has lost over 200 soldiers on the ground to thin air because there are no terrorists in Gaza who are being killed, if you read the report, the complaint of South Africa.
And not only that, I mean, it's also during the Second World War, one has to remember what happened when the Allies went ahead and they also, in order to eradicate Nazi Germany, many Germans were killed. And would anybody have imagined the Nuremberg trials being made and putting on the seat of the accused the Britain and the United States? I mean, nobody would have imagined such a travesty of law, of justice. This cannot be true, but this is what we have here. I mean, and not only that, but when Israel told the Israeli forces, warned the civilian population in Gaza to move south until this place is cleared from the tunnels, from everywhere, from the rockets, because they kept firing rockets into the center of Israel, endangering life here. And when Israel told them, the Hamas kept shooting people who were trying to escape. I mean, they were murdering their own people. Where is their care for their own people? I even saw an interview of one of the leaders of Hamas by a foreign channel, and he was asked, how come when you built all these tunnels, why didn't you build shelters for the population? And his answer was, well, that's the job of the United Nations. We don't have to look after our people. And this is the core of the problem. I mean, it cannot be a population that doesn't care about the life of its own a leadership that doesn't care at all about the life of its population, about our lives. They're the ones who commit crimes, terrible war crimes every day. And they're the ones who, with their proxy, South Africa, complain that Israel is doing a genocide. Now, do you want me to expand a little bit about what's happened in the International Court of Justice?
Yes, I think that's exactly where we could go now, is what happened in those arguments in the International Court of Justice about that South African claim. As I mentioned in the introduction, we understand that there is meant to be a decision given down on the interim sanctions orders that South Africa requested. Just a word of explanation. South Africa claimed that Israel was committing a genocide. It then asked the court to hand down, I think, 9 different orders whose meaning were all the same, that the war against these genocidal Hamas terrorists must end. They must be allowed to fight another day and to carry out another genocide against the Jewish people, because those Jews don't really have the right to defend themselves. Is that an accurate summary of the proceedings, Talia?
Well, it's a bit complicated in the sense that, you know, when you're indicted in a domestic court, you have to appear there and defend yourself, explain, and so on. But in an international court, you only have to appear if you agree to that at the International Court of Justice. Now, the agreement can be made specifically, but it can also be for that case, but it can also be the result of a convention. So since they could have assumed that Israel wouldn't agree to have to appear before the court with respect to the laws of war. There is no duty, there is no such obligation on any state. So South Africa said, well, Israel is doing a genocide to the Arabs in Gaza. Now, and indeed, Israel and South Africa are parties to the Genocide Convention, Article 9 of which obliges the states to have a dispute decided by the court. But what you need is, first of all, to have a dispute regarding the meaning of genocide, and secondly, the interpretation of the convention, and so on and so forth. And secondly, that the party bringing the case has to be a party to the dispute. Now, Israel acted very wisely by asking Professor Malcolm Nathan Shaw to appear on its behalf. Professor Shaw is not only published 9 editions of his very important book on international law, and he's cited widely in the Max Planck Encyclopedia on International Law, but he's also a barrister who has much experience with appearances before the International Court of Justice. And he came to the court and made several things clear. Why the court doesn't have jurisdiction at all to decide the case, because this isn't about genocide. To have genocide, you have to have the intent of murdering people, the people of this ethnic group. But since when does a state that tells the population to separate, does everything it can to open a corridor for them to escape and so on? Where's the intent? How can there be an intent to commit genocide? That's not the case. And if that's not the case, then Article 9 doesn't apply. And South Africa is clearly not a party to the war. We are within the laws of war. And the court has no jurisdiction to decide any law. Now, what South Africa asked the court to do is to tell Israel to cease its operation in Gaza. Now, what happens if we do that? We already know. Even in the last days, they have been launching rockets at Israeli civilian population. So coming up to all the way up to now, it's only Ashdod, it's not Tel Aviv. But if Israel withdraws its troops, then, and not only that, the court should order Israel not even to fight from inside Israel, not only within the Gaza, but also not against Gaza. This is unacceptable. And Professor Shaw made it very, very clear that they have no jurisdiction. It's not the Genocide Convention, but the laws of war. If anybody committed genocide there, it was the Arabs from Gaza and how they behave and all the war crimes that they do, except that a terrorist organization cannot be brought at all before the International Court of Justice because it's not a state. And hopefully it will never become a state. I mean, how can anybody turn over land to a terrorist organization with the hope that it will behave peacefully?
I clearly understand those arguments and the absence of a dispute with South Africa, the absence of an intent to carry out a genocide, and really the absence of any type of basis, whether it be factual or legal, for the ICJ to meet. What unfortunately carries us along is the ICJ judgment from 2004, not judgment, the advisory opinion, in which this same court denied Israel's basic right to self-defense already then, where they said that Israel was not allowed or was in breach of international law by creating a physical barrier that would prevent human walking bombs walking into Israel's civilian society and blowing themselves up, suicide bombers preventing their passage into Israel. And the court said, well, Israel isn't entitled to that right of self-defense. And now we have a judge from Lebanon, a judge from Uganda, to what
From
extent
Somalia,
from Somalia, to what extent are these judges, professional as they may be, capable of disconnecting from their state policy and environment? These are the states that they go back to. These are the states that sent them, that had them appointed. To what extent really are they capable of saying, well, you know what, the Jews really aren't trying to carry out a genocide? Will we see what really should be a unanimous decision of the court saying that this was an unjustified complaint? Or are we going to see here even a split decision maybe, or possibly even a decision to accept the South African claim, even to with a dissenting minority opinion saying, well, Israel isn't carrying out a genocide?
Well, I'm not a fortune teller, but the reality and the sad reality is that the court is like most agencies of the United Nations, it's a political body. Look at what's happening at the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations. It's a shame. It has nothing to do with human rights, with justice, and so on. The United Nations is a failed organization. It could have been okay if there were democratic states, if it was an organization of democracies, but it isn't. The majority of the states that take part are not democracies, and they don't respect human rights at all. And the result, we see it everywhere. At the time, by the way, of the decision, the advisory opinion regarding the wall, one of the judge for the United States was Professor Bergenthal, and he was so upset with the decision that he didn't even write a minority opinion. He simply made a declaration that this whole process is incorrect, and he made a very clear statement about that. Judge Rosalind Higgins from the United Kingdom, although she joined the whole historical, and she put that into inverted commas, the whole historical presentation was simply complete incorrect. And so I have no expectations, fortunately, and that's the good side of it. A number of European states, and also Canada, I think, maybe also Australia, but Germany, the Netherlands, Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic, they side with Israel. They said they would make presentations supporting the statements made by Israel before the court. Now, one has to put the decision in context. The International Court of Justice doesn't have any power to enforce its decisions. So the matter will come back to the Security Council. In the Security Council, we depend upon the veto that will hopefully be cast by the United States. And we'll see what happens.
Is that what's going on with the case of Russia and the Ukraine? Russia's basically using its veto to stop any type of action there being taken, and that's something which is really something that we would need, because that really is the only way to enforce that decision, right?
Correct. There is the International Court of Justice itself has no force, and indeed, I mean, it will be a big, how should I put it? It will be a shame for the International Court of Justice if it decides that it has jurisdiction, that this is a case of genocide committed by Israel. That would be a shameful decision. And it will only provide another proof that for the case to close the United Nations and its institutions, which have not done anything to promote peace in the world.
That we have to remember is even today the UN Human Rights Council, which still has Agenda 7, which is that specific agenda of discussion within every meeting of the UN Human Rights Council, which is dedicated solely to Israel and an attack on Israel. I had a reason to be there, I think almost 6.5 years ago, and you hear 70 different organizations speaking out and condemning Israel, and just a handful of really brave warriors standing up there trying to defend Israel, and that's something which is really a travesty, and that is already this second round of that same committee. There was a previous, the UN Commission for Human Rights, which was the first incarnation of this atrocity, which really did prove itself to be really a terrible disaster that was disbanded in 2004 and then recreated
after being chaired by Libya.
After being chaired by really these
Libya
that have no idea, no connection to, or no idea what even human rights mean, and yet they were the ones who were handing down the decisions. Now, Professor Einhorn, in the same time as we're discussing the case on genocide, and really we touched already upon it from the advisory decision in 2004. There's also that same court, those same judges, are discussing a parallel subject which was referred by the UN General Assembly and in December 2022 regarding the implications of the ongoing occupation of the Palestinian territories. Now, how can this same court be discussing the same subjects that are so pejorative and so detrimental really to everyone and anyone, and then be discussing the claims? How can you have a court, basically in every court system in the world, that's worth that has any value? One of the litigants, whether it be a defendant, definitely that comes before the court, can ask for a judge to be disqualified for showing clear intentional bias, but that doesn't exist in these courts. So how can Israel deal with that? We're talking about people with inherent bias that we can't disqualify. We tried in 2004, it didn't work. So what type of a court is this in the first place? Never mind the decision they make in the end.
Well, first of all, I'll just remind what happened then. The Egyptian judge, just before being appointed to the court, made the statement, because Israel said that it would only defend the question of jurisdiction, and this it will only plead the matter of jurisdiction. And after the court decided that it had jurisdiction, Israel left the case. But the Egyptian judge gave an interview just before being appointed, and he said, saying that even if Israel presented its case on the merits, all of Israel's pleadings would have been found baseless. Now, how can a judge make such a prejudgment? This should disqualify him immediately. And Israel indeed asked the court at the outset to disqualify this judge. But the president of the court from China said, no, I don't disqualify him. And now a judge from Lebanon is sitting there. Lebanon is at war with Israel. So this isn't a proper court, but more important to the merits. And by the way, in my opinion, Israel should do the same. If the court decides that it has jurisdiction and it's dealing with the Genocide Convention, Israel should say, well, henceforth, we don't take part any longer. This is what the United States did in the case of Nicaragua. This is what Israel did with offense. And that's how we should, in my opinion, react to such a decision. But because if we agree, then maybe they do have jurisdiction. That's the rule, if you continue, which is a big mistake. But let's go back. How did these territories become Palestinian territories? They were, just to put things in the historical context, which has everything to do with international law. When the British mandate was made, it first covered not only the west part of the Jordan, but also the east side, where now the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan is. Later on, just before the ratification of the mandate by the League of Nations, they tore Jordan off from in fact, they only got permission to suspend the mandate for that part, but it was a mandate to establish the homeland for the Jewish people. So they got permission to suspend. In fact, they tore it off. 76% of the territory were gone. So Israel was left with the territory to the west of the Jordan. Now came the partition resolution of the United Nations, the General Assembly. First of all, like any such decision is a recommendation. But what happened there, in fact, Israel said that it would agree to the partition in principle, but all Arab states said, no, we don't want that. And they invaded the territory. And at the end of the war, Jordan was left with the West Bank, what they called the West Bank from their point of view, that's Judea and Samaria, and Egypt invaded Gaza. Now, when Israel was became a member of the United Nations, before being accepted as a member, Israel was asked, Abba Eban, who was Israel's representative, going to be, and he was asked if Israel would abide, if the Arab states agreed with the partition resolution. And his answer was no. The United Nations did nothing to enforce that resolution. We had the War of Independence, and this resolution is no more existing. And on the basis of this statement, Israel was admitted as a member of the United Nations because it's a peace-loving country and capable of complying with its duties under the UN Charter. Now comes the Six-Day War, and Israel takes back these territories, which initially should have been part of the homeland for the Jewish people. Now, in the middle, I have to say, Jordan sought to annex the West Bank, but this was never recognized in international law, only two states, Pakistan and Britain, that made a reservation with respect to East Jerusalem. And at the end of the day, 1988, finally, King Hussein even said that he was no longer interested in that part. It's not any longer part of Jordan. But with respect to Gaza, Egypt never even sought to annex it. So how did it become a Palestinian territory? It never was, and it never should be. It's part of the homeland of the Jewish people. And this is the statement that Israel has consistently made to the International Red Cross. And that these areas are not occupied in the sense, because in international law, to be occupied, it's not enough that you occupy, but it has to be taken from a recognized sovereign. And this was not the case with respect to the West Bank, and it was definitely not the case with respect to Gaza. So they're not Palestinian territories.
That's definitely one of the things which unfortunately, if you repeat a lie enough times, said Goebbels, the famous Nazi propagandist, then it becomes reality. And when you're talking about the occupied Palestinian territories, that's really what you're talking about in very, very clear terms. There was no resolution between 1948 and 1967, not one. The UN did not adopt one resolution calling for either Egypt or Jordan to retreat from those territories which had illegally entered into and illegally they occupied. The term the occupied Palestinian territories was only something which was used really towards the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, with the advent of the PLO and everyone else. Really, as I saw a very poignant street sign saying that Palestine is the only country that didn't exist before it was occupied. And that's really the reality. There were no occupied Palestinian territories. No one considered them to be Palestinian territories until Israel liberated them in 1967.
And even in 1967, if you look at the Security Council resolution, it called upon Israel to withdraw, not from the territories, but from territories to withdraw armed forces, not all armed forces. And it didn't, and even when it talked about refugees, it called for a settlement of the problems of the refugees, but it didn't say Arab refugees, because at that time they still remembered that there were also Jewish refugees who had left all their property behind, and had the Arab states even used that property to take care of their brothers, so to speak, there wouldn't be a problem of Palestinian refugees at all.
So,
and by the way, it's important, not only a lie that is repeated catches, also the truth. The truth has to be mentioned again and again. Yeah.
Because it never loses its reality. Unfortunately, our time has flown by, and we need to end. I'll just leave possibly with a little bit of an anecdote of the only Jewish refugee that I know. This is it's an acquaintance of mine who tells the following story. His father was a Palestinian, his mother was Jewish, and he was born to his mother married his father, and she converted to Islam. But under Jewish law, she remains Jewish no matter what, and therefore he himself is Jewish. He is now he's recognized by UNRWA as being a Palestinian refugee, because that's the way that it works. It works by inheritance from the father. His father was a Palestinian refugee. He's a Palestinian refugee. The only catch now being that he's now a religious Jew living in Israel, living in Jerusalem, living his life as a Jew, but he's still recognized by UNRWA as a Palestine refugee. He's one of those 6 million plus refugees that UNRWA represents. Maybe I will try and ask him to come on the program and tell him the briefing and tell a little bit of his stories and his experiences, and explain really just how warped UNRWA is. Professor Einhorn, thank you so much for your time. We really do appreciate you joining us. We will be back with you again tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock Israel time, 9 o'clock in the morning Eastern Standard Time, 2 o'clock in London. We in the meantime, just everybody keep safe, and we will see you again tomorrow.